Good day, and welcome to today's side event on the new IPCC special report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. The SPM was released in November of 2011, and the full report was released in March of 2012. We're confident that the report is already having an impact. It's been downloaded from the internet now over 73,000 times. This special report marks a new kind of venture for the IPCC. It's one in which we brought together a very wide range of researchers, including climate scientists, typical representatives of Working Group 1 of the IPCC, specialists on impacts and adaptation, typical contributors to Working Group 2 of the IPCC, along with people who focus on disaster risk reduction with careers like in the Red Cross and other disaster addressing agencies. The idea of this special report is that there's an important confluence between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation agendas, and the report really explores both the problem space, how the risks of disasters are changing, and the solution space. One of the things that's most gratifying for me is that the emphasis on the solution space is as large and compelling and interesting as the emphasis on the problem space. At the conclusion of the IPCC's fourth assessment report in 2007, it was clear that a changing climate leads to changes in the frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme events. That was really the starting point for the analysis in the special report on extremes. But we quickly realized that when we're trying to understand disasters, what we really are looking at is a risk that emerges from the overlap of three different kinds of factors. One is the physical hazard, the risk of the extreme from climate. The second is the exposure of the population, how much people, how much assets are at risk. And the third is the vulnerability, how prepared people are to cope with the kinds of events that occur. It's only when you understand that disaster risk emerges from the overlap of these three big issues that you can come up with effective strategies for not only understanding, but preparing for, responding to, and managing risk going into the future. We think of this risk at the overlap of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure as representing a target for concentrated action in the future, and the IPCC special report outlines what's changing about the risks and how they can be dealt with. One of the most important conclusions that we see in the report is that losses from disasters have been increasing over the last 30 years. But when you look carefully at the consequences, it's clear that the increase in disaster losses over the last 30 years is associated primarily with an increase in exposure, in the assets, in the amount of stuff that's in harm's way. It's also very impressive when you look at the economic losses from disasters that the economic losses are concentrated in the world's developed countries, while the overwhelming majority of the loss of life, something like 95% of the loss of life, is occurring in the world's developing countries. What that really illustrates is that economic losses are nowhere near the comprehensive metric that we would like to have of the impacts of disasters on people and societies. A second important component of our understanding of the problem space is that we know that some kinds of extreme events have been changing over the last 50 years. This includes extremes of high temperatures. It includes extremes of the fraction of the rainfall that occurs in the heaviest precipitation events. We know that in some places the length and severity of droughts is increasing, the length and severity of droughts is increasing in more places than it's decreasing. And we also know that there is an increase in extreme events that are associated with high sea level, essentially when storm surges piled on top of the kind of sea level rise that we know has occurred globally. And when we look at projections of climate moving into the future, we see an increase in the probability and the risk of extremes from these same four kinds of events: high temperatures, heavy precipitation, the kind of precipitation that can lead to flooding events, the length and severity of droughts and events that are associated with high sea levels. Just to paint a very small picture of the magnitude of the projected changes when we look at heat waves and extreme high temperature events, the projection for a kind of a middle-of-the-road climate scenario is that by the later decades in the century, we're looking at something like a 10-fold increase in the probability of extreme heat waves. A heat wave that currently occurs once every 20 years is projected to occur every 1 to 2 years in the closing decades of the century. A really sobering thought about the changes in extreme, and it really sets up the challenges that we need to deal with in coming up with ways to cope with a world in which not only extremes are changing, but also vulnerabilities changing and exposures changing. This more or less defines what I think of as the problem space for extreme events. One of the most gratifying things about working on the IPCC Special Report is that we had a chance to delve deeply into the issue of the solution space, what our options are, how they play out, and what we need to do to take effective action on them. And for a detailed discussion of the solution space, I'm happy to turn the floor over to my colleague. Thanks very much.